Welcome back. What is a service? The answer to this question can be quite straightforward. It is something that helps somebody to do something. And it doesn't matter, is it a private person, is it a private company, or is it a public entity? Also, when preparing for this session, I found really interesting fact that in UK, 1/3 of the GDP comes from services. And imagine if we design bad services, what a waste of money. Ladies and gentlemen, esteemed participants, welcome to this session where we explore the details of designing people-centric public services that truly resonate with the users. In a rapidly evolving digital landscape, understanding the secrets of service design and success is really crucial. We will explore various factors critical achieving excellence in public service design, from polishing essential skills to fostering collaboration, really relevant, and making wise digital choices. And together, we aim to clarify the mysteries behind creating services that meet and exceed even the user expectations. However, success does not come without challenges and without failures. Also, during this session, we will address common hurdles such as navigating legal compliance, overcoming limited user experience and engagement, and modernizing outdated technology. By identifying and tackling these obstacles head-on, I hope we cover the way for transformative change and innovation in public service delivery. I'm honored to serve you as a moderator for today's session. My name is Piret Hirv, and as a senior expert of the E-Governance Academy, I really look forward to facilitating and engaging, insightful presentation, and also dialogue after this presentation. To guide you and us through this discussion, we have the privilege today, and I really congratulate you all who managed to come to this hall. We have the privilege of hearing from a distinguished speaker. Please join me in welcoming Downe, founder of the School of Good Services. Lou is coming from UK, and Lou's expertise in service design will undoubtedly enrich our conversation later on. And together, let's explore the secrets of service design. Thank you. Lou, welcome.
Excellent, the music stopped. I'll start talking now. Thank you all for coming to the session. I know it's a session after lunch, but hopefully it will be interesting and informative and a bit of a gear shift, a little bit from maybe some of the other talks that we've heard today. I know that a lot of the conference has been about technology and about data and about all of those other aspects of e-government services. But today I'm going to be talking about another really important aspect of that, and that is design and the experience that our users have of those services that we're transforming. So we're going to be talking a little bit about that today. So my name is Downe, and I run an organization called the School of Good Services, and we work with all sorts of different organizations in the public and private sector to help them to build the type of skills that are needed to be able to design and deliver good services. And we've been talking about that a lot today. It's been interesting that capacity building and skill building has come up a lot. Before that, though, I used to be Director of Design and Service Standards for the UK central government, working on this website here, a website called gov.uk, which, if you spent time nosing around different governments' websites, you might have seen gov.uk. Some of those patterns and styles have been taken to other government websites as well. So I'm going to be talking about some examples from this. But specifically, today, I really want to talk about services. And firstly, what services are, which might seem like a really obvious question, but actually, it's a lot harder to answer in reality when it comes to our own services. So I'm going to talk about what services are. I'm going to talk about why they're important and why we need to keep talking about them and keep reminding ourselves that this is what we're here to do. And then I'm going to finish up by talking a little bit about some things that we can do really simply within our organization to move forward our ability to be able to design them better for our users. So I'm going to start off with a story. And it's a story about a woman called Anne. And Anne is a school teacher. She works in a place called Rochdale, which is just outside of New York in the US. And she's a school teacher, quite young kids between the ages of 5 and 7. And she's got 3 children of her own as well. So Anne is a school teacher. She lives in one of the most expensive places in the world. And she's the sole earner for 3 children. So a lot of stuff going on for Anne. And needless to say, she is pretty financially stressed, amongst other things. So Anne qualified as a teacher in 2001, so a little while ago, and she earns the equivalent of about $55,000 per year. So reasonable salary, but not nearly enough to cover all of those expenses, those 3 children, and all sorts of other things. So she does several other jobs alongside her teaching profession. And the reason for this is partially because she also owes the US government around $100,000 in student loans, which I don't know about you, but that might seem like a lot. It might not seem like a lot, but it certainly seems like a lot to me to pay in student loans. But it's an average amount if you're going to study to be a teacher in the US. The problem is that, of course, she cannot afford to make those monthly repayments back to that loan because she has water and gas and electric and rent and all of these other things to pay that are way more important than paying off her student loan, frankly. The good news is, though, that Anne is technically eligible for a scheme that means that as a public sector worker, she doesn't have to repay back that loan at all. She gets to wipe it off completely. But there are some conditions to that loan agreement, and it basically means that she has to make 120 consecutive payments over a period of 10 years, which seems like a really difficult commitment, but actually those payments can be really, really small. They could be as small as $1 or $2, so it's actually a really good deal. You just have to make that direct debit for 10 years, and then you get to wipe out that $100,000 worth of debt. So pretty good deal. The problem is, though, that on top of the many years that Anne has now been paying off that loan, she's going to be paying it off for another 25 years. And she'll be doing that because of this company. And this is a company called Navient, who are one of several different administrators of this particular government scheme. It's a private company, provides private loans to students who are studying for all sorts of different things, but it administrates this government scheme. And what Navient practice is a thing called the 7-minute rule. And the 7-minute rule means that if you work at Navient and you answer the phone to someone like Anne who says, hey, I can't afford to make those monthly repayments, can I lower my payments, can I do something else? Essentially, you have 7 minutes to answer that phone call and then put the phone down, otherwise you lose your bonus. And if you work at Navient, you earn even less than Anne does, so they're very disincentivized to have those phone calls go on longer than 7 minutes. So basically, what happens? Well, Anne basically phones up to lower her payments, make sure that she can keep in with that scheme, and every single time that happens, she's told to pause them. Because the only thing you can do for a customer within 7 minutes is to pause their payments. Lowering those monthly repayments and helping her to keep in with that scheme and write off her loan, that would take extra forms, credit checking, all sorts of other things. And of course, that never happens because they've got a bonus and a target to meet. So rather than 120 consecutive payments over 10 years, when I last spoke to Anne, she had made 83 consecutive payments over 20 years and was working 3 jobs to try and pay this off. So the reason why I'm telling you this story is because bad services ruin people's lives, but they do it in often quite subtle and hard to spot ways. And there's certainly not things that we're deliberately setting out to do. Very rarely will it be the case that our services are bad because we wake up in the morning and we go, I really, really want to make sure that all of the teachers in the world have to work 3 jobs to carry on surviving doing their job. The reason why Navient did this was because they wanted to create a more efficient service. So, there was a logical reason why they did it. But the problem is, particularly when it comes to government services, we're dealing with massive amounts of people, and it's not just the effect on those individuals, we're talking about the effect on society as well. And actually, if we look at just this example, in 2018, there was actually a record shortage of school teachers in the US. And not just because of Navient, I should say. There are other loan providers that are available. But Navient is a large company. One of the main reasons why people are leaving the teaching profession is because they say that they can't afford to carry on doing it. And if Navient are doing this, then probably other loan providers are doing the same. And if we look at the effect that that's having then on school children, 80% of teachers of schools, in California alone, so one of the largest states in the US, are now appointing unqualified teachers because they can't get hold of people like Anne anymore. So bad services have an impact on individual users. They have a long-term, very hard to spot impact societally as well. But they also cost us a huge amount of money. And Piret mentioned this at the very beginning. In the UK, in a government context, 80% of government spending is spent on services, which is not really surprising. We are the oldest and largest service provider in the UK, so it makes sense that 80% of the cost of government is spent on providing those services to users. What is more surprising and shocking, though, is that up to 60% of that cost is spent basically on calls and on casework. So basically people phoning up government saying, hey, how do I do this thing? It's confusing, I can't find that answer on gov.uk, what's going on? Or you've had my passport for 6 months and it's taking you ages to process it, can I have it back? Or people failing to fill in forms correctly, that thing going to a human being, and then that human being having to do something about it. And if you're wondering the kind of proportion of people who are phoning because they can't use digital services, it's actually really, really small. It's a very, very small number of people who are phoning because they're digitally excluded from those services. The vast majority are phoning because they've already tried to find something on gov.uk and they couldn't get hold of it. And they don't know where it is, and they're confused about the process, or it doesn't work for them and it's not accessible. And when we think about the fact that a third of UK GDP is spent on public services, that is a lot of money that we are potentially wasting on bad services. Now, you can imagine that I spent all of my 7 years as a civil servant in government poking at this number and going, why is this not hitting the headlines in the same way that a bad IT procurement would, or any other decision? And I think the problem is that services and the cost that we spend on them and the impact on our users is invisible to us most of the time. And it's because we don't see all of these things collectively. We don't look at the impact of all of these different processes and systems and things that we do really as a whole. So we see, one call center answering lots of calls and we think that's normal, but we don't see the long tail spread across that whole area as actually really problematic. And it's because we see our services as a set of isolated interactions. So just to give you an example of what this looks like, this is a healthcare journey, which you might be familiar with. It might look slightly different in Estonia, but it's certainly in the UK. If you feel ill, probably you're going to start with Googling your symptoms. Hopefully you don't end up on some kind of wild bit of the internet that makes you think awful things. Previously to that, you probably feel unwell. After that, hopefully you will go and see your doctor if it's needed, or general practitioner, GP as we call them. After that, you might then get a referral appointment to go and see a specialist. You might then see that specialist and you might get a prescription. Now, every single one of these different pieces is owned by a completely separate part of the National Healthcare Service. And you might think that the National Healthcare Service is one organization. Of course, it isn't. It's hundreds of different organizations who are no more inclined to work with each other than any other private sector organizations, to be honest. So if you go and see your GP to get a referral, you've got to hope that perhaps maybe they're sending the right information to that referral appointment so that they have your medical records. And you've got to hope that they also have your correct address. And if you've moved recently, you haven't told your GP, then that referral appointment's going to go to an address that you no longer live at. So the quality of our services are not just defined by the quality of these individual parts of it, your doctor's website or the referral, kind of reception area, or all of these other things that you will experience. It's also defined by the quality of these handover moments between these different parts of a service. And the problem is that that journey is shared, as will most service journeys in government be the same. They're mostly shared by different organizations that have to work together to reach an end outcome, which means that because they're shared, no one really has full visibility of all of them, and they end up being kind of invisible to us. And because of that, we don't design them. It's really difficult to design something that's invisible to us. So our first challenge when we talk about service design is to actually make those services visible, not just to ourselves, but to everyone else in our organization as well. And of course, what happens when we don't design our services? We kind of force our users to. And I'm just showing you this photograph to kind of illustrate what this feels like. I know many of you will have seen desire pathways before. It's 2024. But this is what it feels like. We've designed this, what we think is the perfect pathway for our user over there. But actually, what they want to do is over here. And not only have we not designed something that's going to work for them, we've also made them work to create that own experience for themselves. They have to trudge across that grass and get their feet dirty to be able to get to the end of that. It's a lot harder. But also, it has a negative impact on us, because when our users are the ones who are piecing together all these different things and forming those service journeys to get to that outcome, be it a health outcome or getting a passport or whatever that looks like, they become the only people who know how our services work. And it means that we're sat there going, well, I don't know, which pieces of these, kind of systems and processes and tools am I supposed to bring together? Because actually, I don't have visibility of them. The users are the only people who see those things. So now that I've depressed you all after lunch, how do we get out of this mess is the question. And I think the answer to this is really cultivating an understanding of ourselves and our organizations as service providers. I would imagine lots of your organizations will be talking about digital literacy and digital capacity, but most of our services will never be entirely online. And even if they are, we'll have web chat, we'll have email, we'll probably have some form of telephony, we'll have internal systems, we'll have policies, we'll have people. They're never just going to be a digital interface. So we need to understand what it means to be a service provider way before we understand what it means to put that service on the internet. And this really comes down to three very basic components. And they're basic, but they're hard to do, obviously. First of all, seeing services as things that can and should be designed, not things that happen as an accidental byproduct of all of these other sort of technology decisions or personal preference or other things that go on in our organization, but seeing services in the same way that our users see them. The second thing is actually understanding what makes a good service. And I'll get onto this in just a moment, but even though we've all got a very consistent set of things that we as users need from services, actually all of those things go completely out the window when it comes to our own services. And it's a bit like that metaphor, I don't know if you have it here, of the hairdresser's hair always being the worst or the dentist's teeth being the worst. It's the same with our services. We can point at Amazon and go, oh, that's terrible. But we look at our services and we go, well, it's absolutely fine. Oh, it's totally fine not to send someone an email when we've received an application for something. So we often just don't see the problems with our own services. And then lastly, committing to designing them, committing the people and the time and the money and the resources, not just to design the surface layer, but to actually really think about the processes and the policies, things like, how long are our call center staff allowed to spend on the phone to someone, for example. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time now talking about this middle bit, because this really, I think, is one of the hardest parts of this conversation, actually getting everyone around the same table to understand what do we mean by a good service. And one of the biggest myths that we tell ourselves that allows us to just avoid this question entirely is that it depends. It depends on what kind of service we're providing as to what good looks like for our users. And it means that we end up with this massive barrier of going, well, we can't possibly know what good looks like for our users unless we go and speak to them. And this is not me telling you not to do user research, by the way. You absolutely should. But there are some things that almost every single user needs of almost every single service. And these are really basic, fundamental things that we all know, probably, when it comes to our own interaction with services. But when it comes to our own services, maybe not so much. So things like being able to find it, being able to use it without already being an expert in how it works. It's quite a big one for government services. We like people to read really long descriptions of stuff for hours on end, and then if they don't, we blame them for making mistakes. That's a good thing. Being able to complete it from start to finish without getting any dead ends. So if you lose your mobile phone or you don't have access to the email address, can you still use the service, sorry. So there are 15 of these things, and I'm still in the market for a 16th. So if you think of any, let me know. But there are 15 principles of good service design that have been evolved now over several years and have been contributed to by thousands of people all over the world before they ended up being published in the book, Good Services. And these are the principles, and hopefully none of them strike you as particularly world-shaking. There's nothing on this list that is rocket science, I don't think. But doing them is a little bit harder than just acknowledging them, that they are probably things that we should be doing. So I'm going to talk about two of them, because I don't have time to talk about all of them today. I'm going to talk about two that I think are probably the most important and also sometimes the most difficult to do. And if you can just focus on these two things, you'd be halfway, probably, to actually making a better service. So I'm going to start with making sure your service is easy to find. Now, who here thinks their service is really easy to find for their users? Ooh, some people bold, like it. Yes, well, I hope it is. It should be. Quite a lot of people very cautious, maybe just not feeling like putting up your hand. That's okay. Being easy to find is one of those things that we think should be really, really easy to do. In reality, is a lot harder. And as Piret said earlier, a service is something that helps someone to do something. That shapes what they think about looking for when they sit down at Google or whatever other search engine they're using to find our service. And this kind of idea of a thing that they're looking for is often quite simple, quite straightforward, and something that we would probably write down on our to-do list or ask a friend or colleague for help with. Things like learn to drive or buy a car or employ someone. All of these things are pretty straightforward. But the problem is, because our user has that mental model of the tasks that they want to get done, they are the person who decides what that service is and how it's framed, which is really inconvenient because we have a very definite definition of what our services are very often that are quite different to what our users think they are. But this is something that we learned really the hard way on gov.uk. Gov.uk is a big website. It has about 500,000 pages and about 1.7 million visits per week. And of the stuff that is on gov.uk, about 10,000 of them are services. And I say about 10,000 because no one's actually managed to make a complete count of all the government services that there are, which I find absolutely, isn't that shocking? I find that absolutely shocking. But anyway, 10,000 is as close as we possibly managed to get to a number of government services. And this is a small selection of some of our beautiful services that we have on gov.uk. So things like employer ownership pilot or reporting of injuries, diseases, and dangerous occurrences or regulations in 1995. Does anyone know what any of these things are? No, okay. I'd be really impressed if you did, to be honest. I was shown this list to so many civil servants, and even though their department might run these services, they still don't know what they are. So if you don't know what they are, and our government doesn't know what they are, our users really do not have a hope of actually understanding what any of these services are. And my favorite is a service called ARAMS, which is the Sheep and Cattle Tracing Service. And obviously it's a pun on a male goat. So we love to give things acronyms and then work backward to work out what the name of the service is. Funny for us as civil servants, not great for our users. And the outcome of this is quite profound. And if we look at it sort of cumulatively, it has a really massive effect. This is the top content on gov.uk of stuff that people are looking for right now. And you can see at number 8 is contact the DVLA, which is the Drivers and Vehicles Licensing Agency. So basically the organization that does driver's licenses and vehicle testing and all that sort of stuff. But essentially it's a phone number. And it sort of means that the 8th most popular service on gov.uk right now is not a digital service, it's a phone number. So something is going wrong here in the way that we are thinking about naming and understanding our services. And the problem that we have is quite a simple and straightforward one. And it's that most of our services were just simply not designed to be found by people who didn't already know what that service actually was. Because our services were not designed for the internet. They were designed for this world, where you walked into your post office or your frontline government agency, and you said to a person behind the desk, I'm trying to, get a tree felling license, or I'm trying to learn to drive, or I'm trying to become a childminder, or something else. And that person would help you to find the right form, they'd help you to fill it in. If it was a post office, they would probably help you to post it. But that, of course, is not how services work today. And Google is the homepage to our services. And unless people can get from that search for learn to drive or become a childminder to your service, they're going to get lost. So what we end up with, and the reason why we have this massive problem on gov.uk right now, is that we have a big pile of Google fails. So stuff that people won't be able to find unless they already know what they're looking for. And of course, how do they know what they're looking for if they've never found it before? They don't. So that's why they end up looking for a phone number. And this is where we get into a really, really important aspect of how we need to label and name our services. And if you take one thing away from today, just go back to your service and have a think about whether or not the name of it makes sense to someone who's never heard of it before. Because really, the way that we need to be thinking about this is that good services are verbs. So they're active doing phrases, things that people are going to be typing into Google and looking for, not stuff that are the names of things that we understand but they don't. So things like learn to drive, become a childminder, get a pension, not statutory off-road vehicle notification. And, I'm sorry, but I would extend it to E something, I something, my something. I don't know if you've got any of those things, but those are hard to find as well. And the good news is, doing this, changing the name of your service, can be really, really straightforward to do. It's politically different and difficult sometimes, but actually, technically, we do it all the time. This is a great example. This is a service called the Statutory Off-Road Vehicle Notification Service, and basically helps people to stop paying tax on their vehicle when they're not using it anymore. They changed the name of it from this really complicated and hard to understand noun to just something that was even slightly more verb-based. And in 2 weeks, basically 2 weeks worth of work, they managed to have a 15% reduction in the number of calls. And there was no technical change, there wasn't really any design change, it was literally just the name of the service. So it's a really, really quick and simple and cheap way of making your service more accessible. But I'm going to talk about one more principle here, and this one is kind of tracking back a little bit inside our organization. Because we've talked quite a lot now about the user experience and about some things that we can do really easily to change that, make that more accessible. But when it comes to providing good services, we also need to incentivize our staff to work in the right way possible. And we've already seen a good example of Navient incentivizing their staff to provide a bad service. There are loads of examples of this. But the way in which we mostly incentivize behavior is through really subtle means that actually we probably aren't paying that much attention to. And it's usually through service quality KPIs, which if you do an image search for, you will probably see some quite bad PowerPoints, but you will also see a lot of things that actually don't really measure service quality at all. What they measure are indicators that our service is still working. So things like number of calls, number of people on the website. They don't measure whether or not someone actually got to the outcome they wanted to, or whether or not that was a really good service for them. And sometimes not measuring those things can also mean that we end up measuring things that create a worse service as a result. And I want to just tell you one more brilliant example. And it's about something that happened a long time ago. You might recognize this guy, Tony Blair, previous UK Prime Minister. And when he was up for re-election, one of the things that he did, like many prime ministers who are trying to get re-elected, was to show all of the amazing things that he had done in his previous term, and to basically say, well, you should be electing me next time. And the thing that Tony Blair chose at that moment in time was the NHS, the National Healthcare Service. And the problem we had was that it was taking a really, really long time to get access to a doctor's appointment. So he decides to put in place a really ambitious KPI for the NHS. Basically gives them 6 months in the run-up to the pre-election period, and he says, Basically, I want you to cut the waiting time to see a doctor to 48 hours. No more headlines about weeks-long appointment waiting lists. I don't want to hear about it. I want you to cut your waiting list to 48 hours. And that's what I want. So 6 months later, Tony Blair goes on to a show called Newsnight, which if you've ever seen it or any other political commentary show, you'll know you don't get away lightly for saying amazing things. So he's talking about how fantastic this is and what a great policy success it is. But he faces quite a difficult challenge from someone in the audience. And it was a woman called Diana Church who raised her hand and she said, hang on a second, Mr. Blair, this is not my experience of it at all. I can't make a doctor's appointment now in a week's time because I basically am told that I have to make it 48 hours beforehand. Sounds suspicious. And then when I try and call on the day, I can't get through. I think we can probably all work out what happened here, and probably Tony Blair's government should have realized that this was going to happen. But rather than cutting the waiting time to see a doctor to 48 hours, which is what they were supposed to be doing, of course, these doctor surgeries who had no other resources, no other guidance, no support to be able to meet this KPI, did the only thing possible, and that was to make sure that nobody could book an appointment earlier than 48 hours. So that if you called within that magical 48-hour window, you guaranteed of an appointment, and they were guaranteed of meeting their KPI. So on paper, this looked really successful. You know, everyone got the appointment that they needed, but we didn't record all the people who couldn't get through because it was basically like getting Glastonbury tickets. You know, I want to see a doctor, boop, can't get through. Also, all the people who were forced to book an appointment when actually they didn't need one because they needed to wait for 2 weeks for something else to happen. So we managed to meet the target, but we completely missed the point, which of course was to make sure that people got a doctor's appointment when they needed one. Now, the reason why I show you this quote of what Tony Blair said in response to this is because this is basically the response that I have had to many, many policy problems that I have poked a stick at. And people go, well, obviously it's not supposed to work in that way. It was a great idea, which is badly delivered by you lot over there. But this is the problem with separating ideas and delivery. You can't. And so, of course, obviously it would work in that way because when it comes to measurement in our services, what gets measured gets done. And if we put in place a target that says you need to do something within 48 hours or 7 minutes or whatever that thing is, then that is what our staff will do. And then we end up basically not delivering the outcome we're trying to get to in order to meet the target that we're trying to meet. So when we're thinking about outcomes, we really should be thinking about measuring the overall outcome that we're trying to get to, not just that individual task that we want to get done. So all the things I've talked about so far, hopefully have given the impression that when we talk about service design, really we're talking about 10% design. 10% of that really great bit that we all enjoy, where we think about what the user experience should be, and we think about how all those things work together, and what that user journey is, and all of those great things that we think about as design. But 90% of the work of service design is about creating the conditions for any of this stuff to happen, and about helping the rest of our organization to see these problems in the same way that we do. So I'm going to finish this talk by talking about this last point here, this point around committing to designing our services, because this is also really difficult. And sometimes it feels like we're just waging a war with this massive, really confusing set of cultural ideals that don't quite work in the way that they need to for our users. So I want to talk a little bit about really how do we make service design a priority when it's not anyone's priority. And I'm going to talk about 7 things, actually, because I added 2 last night after some conversations with people that I thought would be good to talk about. So I'm going to talk about 7 things very quickly. First one, make service design and make the user experience everyone's problem. This is not just an issue with user experience designers or user researchers or digital teams. This is everyone's problem. Anyone who is deciding what a service is and how it works, they have a responsibility to how that service is used by our users. So in the UK, the way that we did this was created a service standard. Any service that goes onto gov.uk has to meet this service standard. And right at the top there is that your service has to understand users and their needs. Now, I'm not going to pretend by any means that this has been 100% successful. Certainly hasn't. But it forces people to at least think about it and to at least get a user researcher in their team or in their proximity to understand at least what those problems actually are. So making it everyone's problem, it's a gateway. In order to get onto gov.uk, you have to have done this. The second thing is to understand actually what our services are. Now, this is not a list of services, this is a list of forms and transactions. But if you ask any member of the UK government who runs one of these things whether or not this is a service, they will probably tell you that it is. So part of our problem is actually seeing services in the same way that our users do. Now, there's some really great examples of organizations that have done this and have actually created different lists of what their users think their services are, so that they can understand how all these different things fit together as a set of services. This is a list by the Home Office. The Home Office is about 50,000 people that do everything from policing to borders and passports and visas. So knowing that someone else in the organization is also working on this overall journey that you're part of, probably the only way you're going to find that out is through this website that is now published on the internet. So it's a really great way of helping people to come together and coalesce around those particular services. The next thing, which I know has been mentioned a lot already today, is actually supporting the growth of design skills. And that's not just with hiring in designers and experts. Partially it is. This is Alistair Duggan, who was head of accessibility at GDS and for the cross-government community within the UK government. And hiring Alistair was one of my jobs, making sure that we had someone who was able to set standards and supportive guidance and provide training around accessibility, because it's a hard thing to understand for a lot of people. So partially it is about bringing in expertise, things that we don't know about, and holding up our hand and saying, actually, we do need some help with these things. But partially, it's about creating those communities that can share knowledge with each other. You know, the design of gov.uk is more than the sum of its parts. It means all of those different designers across those government departments, which we ended up with about 2,000 of them at the end. This is just a small selection of them. All of those people need to be able to work with the same tools in the same way, with the same ideology, the same ideas about what good looks like. So supporting those collaborative communities is vital. The next thing we can do is actually helping people to collaborate. Like I said, all of the services that we're working on are probably shared by multiple different organizations. We need to actively support that collaboration. It doesn't just happen because we put it in one of the pillars of our strategy or something else. People actually need money and time and permission to be able to come together around those things. So one of the things that we did was to create a program called the Service Communities. And service communities were essentially money, time, permission from senior leaders to bring together groups of people who were all working on the same services. So things like coming to the UK and staying or starting a business. All of those people could come together, they could share user research, they could share stuff they were working on. And those things over time actually kind of pushed against that siloed nature of government structure. Didn't completely fix it, but you know, I'm not responsible for the organizational chart of government. No one is. So doing this was our only way of bringing together those groups of people. And it's a really light touch thing that you can do as well. Just have a look for service communities. There's loads of blog posts and guidance about how we did it. Another thing I want to just talk about, though, is actually holding everyone accountable for service performance. Government services don't have shareholders. We don't have a stock market. There is nothing, really, apart from the press and ourselves, to hold ourselves accountable to the people who are paying for our government services. So one of the things that we did really early on was create a thing called the Service Performance Platform. And it allowed government to basically publish performance on how well it was doing against all of those different criteria that they were supposed to be providing public services against. And so that we could see what was going on, who was doing well, who wasn't doing well, but also how, you know, the public could see whether or not those services were working properly. And actually, this is the Cabinet Minister, Sir Francis Maude, checking up on how well the driving services were working ahead of a meeting that he had with the Minister for Transport. They weren't doing that well. So it was a really great tool to allow people to actually kind of hold each other to account at a leadership level. The next thing you can do is actually just make it really hard to do things wrong. You know, all of those things are aiming to make things better and making it easier to do the right thing, but you can also stop people from doing the wrong thing or make it hard to do the wrong thing. And this is part of that. This is the thing called the design system. And it's a set of tools and essentially kind of design patterns for how to make a service that looks like gov.uk. And it means that really there's a limit to how far you can go wrong when you're using these patterns. It means that we can create services much more quickly, much more cheaply, with fewer people in the team, and ultimately is a hugely important resource in being able to provide fast-moving digital services in the UK government now. Other things that we did as well, we just made the font bigger on gov.uk so people would write less. So, policymakers love writing loads and loads of text. If you make the font bigger, they'll be worried about people scrolling all the way down to the bottom of a really long page. If you make the font bigger, the page gets longer. It's a simple trick, but it worked really well. We also put in place part of the standard that you have to test the service with the minister. It's amazing how many ministers have never seen a service before, and as soon as they do start testing it, they go, why the hell is that working like that? You should definitely take that out. So 6 weeks of user research or 1 hour with the minister, It was really, really effective tool at actually making some major changes to services. But the last thing that I want to talk about here, and I promise I'll stop talking then, is to show why doing nothing is actually as risky, if not more risky, than doing something. Often, part of our problem, particularly in government services, is that we have this really high level of risk aversion. And it doesn't just apply to really critical services where we do need to have that really heightened sense of risk, but it also applies to just things like talking to our users or making a simple change to make it more accessible. And we become super risk averse to doing anything. And what happens with that is that we start to see doing nothing to our services as a bit of a neutral option. So if we just leave them for the next 10 years, then surely nothing bad will happen. Of course it will. Services don't stand still, neither does technology. Things move on. Doing nothing is not a neutral position. And we're so afraid of the newspapers, of doing something wrong, that I think often we don't have the bravery ourselves to make those experimental leaps to do things differently. And that's not an accusation. I understand this is really, really difficult, but I think often what we can't find ourselves in a situation of is this kind of wall of whataboutery, where someone says, well, what about if this doesn't work? What about if we spend too much money? What about if we do all this user research and then it doesn't work anyway? Well, of course, yes. These are all really relevant questions. But they also have a really effective effect of sabotaging any change whatsoever. Because if you listen to all these things, we'd never do anything. And actually, I want to finish up by just showing you something that kind of illustrates just how effective those questions are at sabotaging any change. The text is really small, I apologize, but this is a document called the CIA Simple Sabotage Field Manual, which, if you've never read it, definitely worth a sort of Wikipedia rabbit hole after this session. This is basically a set of guidance that was given by the US government to CIA agents to disrupt enemy organizations in the 1940s. And it is a fantastic guide on how some of the really basic elements of management culture just really stifle any change whatsoever. My favorite here is bring up irrelevant issues as frequently as possible. Or, where possible, refer all matters to committees for further study and consideration. Attempt to make those committees as large as possible, never less than 5. So if you find yourself in a meeting next week with more than 5 people, just start looking around. But no, seriously, the reason why I show this is that I think we don't often see some of the detrimental effect of things that we just take for granted as the way that work works. These are really bad things for progress. If we want to do things differently, we shouldn't be doing these things. And I think ultimately the question we need to ask ourselves when we're faced with this onslaught of whataboutery is really, what happens if we don't do this? What happens if we don't make that change? Or if we don't improve this service, or we don't make it accessible? Because those things will find their way into the news anyway. We might think that they won't, but they will eventually. So I'm going to leave you with that question just to think about. But if you are interested in any of the things that I've talked about today, you can find loads of interesting, useful blog posts about things like what is a service, how do services work, also lots of courses in how to design and deliver better public services, and you can find them all here on good.services. And you can find me at all of these different places as well. So thank you very much. I think we're going to do some questions.
Thank you, Lou. And we definitely do have questions. So let's use our time wisely and start asking the questions. Could you please kind of elaborate, what are the signs that your service design project was successful? And also, could you give us a few, like 1, 2 examples of really successful projects that you have been part of?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I think probably one of the big indicators on whether or not your work has been successful is obviously if you then do your user research and you find out that people can use it. And if you find that no one is phoning you and no one is emailing you and it's just working very quietly on its own, then that's kind of a measure of success, which can feel like a bit of an anticlimax, I think, for a lot of teams, that if it's really working well, nothing happens. But it is a good example. I think probably my best example of a service, and this was one that was designed and delivered by the Home Office, so the organisation that I showed you who did the big list of services, is the passport service. And that service is now fully completable online, so you can upload a digital photograph, we can recognise your face, you can use your photograph for your driving licence. And the reason why I think this is a great example is not just because it's an end-to-end digital service, but because there was a huge amount of work that went into the accessibility of it. So obviously when someone's taking a photograph of their face, people have different facial features. People are wearing different things on their heads. There's lots of things that might disrupt with a photograph of someone's face. There was a huge amount of testing to make sure that that worked. Also, primary legislation had to be changed to remove the need for actual physical signature, which meant that people didn't have to go and find a doctor or a lawyer or any of the professions, which most people don't know these people. So that was a big barrier to people getting passports. And I think it was a great example of that, but also a great example of the fact that the team is still working on it. So it's still being improved, it's still being updated. Because of course, technology changes and so do user needs. So yeah, it's a good example for lots of different reasons, I think.
So, but service design definitely demands resources. But how do you balance user needs with business objectives and constraints?
Yeah.
So to find this correct moment, okay, now it's fine for the user, but we are also not bankrupt.
Yeah. Yeah, so I think the thing to think about is if we provide a service that is not sustainable, it's not going to be good for users anyway, is it? Because we're going to end up making a service that we can't provide in 5 years' time. And so that's not going to be great. So a good service always has to be a balance of what's good for individual users, what's good for society, and what's good for our organization, but also what's good for the planet as well. That's a set of users that we need to think about that doesn't have a voice. So, and I don't know, that was quite a conversation earlier on today. So, yeah, that is a big aspect of it. I think it's also about understanding how we balance all of the different needs that are in our service. So if our staff have a need to do something really quickly, but our users have a need to do something really simply and not give us the right information that our staff need, a good service doesn't just pick one of those users, it picks both of them and says, okay, how can we balance the needs of both those people? Because if you just make it easy for your staff, it's not going to work for your users. If you just make it easy for your users, it's not going to work for staff and the whole service won't work. So I think it's often about balance, but you have to listen to people's voices to get that balance in the first place, I think.
So service design is a process. And you also have a team doing this. And those people, they are also human beings. And you coming with the new ideas, new methods, how to design services. But hey, they have done this for, 10, 15 years, using the same tools, same means, same patterns. So how to manage the change management inside the design team?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I mean, I think part of it is about not sort of painting designers or indeed any one profession as the kind of savior of a project, right? So, a designer doesn't just swoop into something and go, well, you've done everything wrong for the last 10 years. There's often really good reasons why an organization has done something in the way that it has. But often things have moved on since that time. And so I think a lot of it is about understanding the reasoning of the decisions that have gone before, if you can find that out, and understanding actually what are pragmatic moves to making the service better. You know, often it can be something as really simple as just taking those inaccessible PDFs and putting them online. Even if you can't do anything else other than that, that's still better. So it doesn't have to be all or nothing. You know, you can make incremental improvements to the design of services, and you can do a lot of good that way, I think.
So, but you talked about services, and services should not have dead ends. There is a question like, could you please elaborate it a bit more? And what is the best practice to state services requesting limited amount of technology to use, like card readers, phones, other means of verification, etc., to have as little hassle around the service as possible?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So, I mean, dead ends happen in services where a user can't go forward because they don't have something that we're asking for usually. And it's usually something that we have made mandatory as a requirement of a security check, usually. That's the moment when it happens. And it will be something like a phone number or bank account or physical address, email address, that sort of thing. The problem that we have is that we ask for multiples of those things. So we ask for like 10, 20 different, items of verification. And then we wonder why someone can't use a service. Because, of course, if you have a physical address, you need to have a bank account. If you have a bank account, you need to have had a physical address. And internet connection is not a free thing. To have a stable internet connection means that you have an email address. Phone numbers can be compromised or lost. So I think the thing to remember is every single one of those things comes with a cost to users. And every single one of those things can be lost at any moment in time. So to not rely on 10 different things, think about what the kind of, degradation is. So could you rely on 2 or 3 of them or 1 of them? Perhaps, with other ways of checking security of identity that allow people to have backups to the service. My favorite example of this is actually something that really should never have happened. I don't know if this happened to anyone, but back when Uber first came to the UK, if you lost your phone in the back of an Uber, you were told you needed to basically provide a 2-step verification password, which was sent to your phone to get your phone back. So this is not a government problem. This isn't everyone problem. So many services don't think about what happens when you lose something or something is compromised or you don't have access to a bank account. And I think it's thinking about those unhappy pathways, those things that might happen to users, and just look at your service and how it works under those different circumstances.
You said that there is no stock market for services, and but one of the listeners noticed that but there are elections.
There are.
Yeah.
In June.
For us. And designing services, especially when you talked about healthcare, this takes time.
Yeah.
And in most cases, it takes longer than the span between the two election points.
Yeah.
So, what can you do?
Yeah.
Huh? New guys are coming and new strategies.
Yeah.
And you're still on the halfway with your service design.
Yeah, this is such a perpetual problem. I get asked this a lot because it is a real issue. Part of it, I think, is about using those crisis opportunities, for want of a better word. And, if there is a re-election or if something has hit the news or there is a review, using those opportunities to make users' voices heard in those sorts of things. And providing opportunities to change those services within that context. The other part of it, I think, is also just having clarity on the fact that often the changes that we're making are not really rooted in any particular political perspective. Sometimes they are. If you think about benefits, for example, a government that is slightly more right-leaning might have slightly lower levels of benefits. A government that's left-leaning will have slightly higher levels of benefits. But the benefit system still needs to exist. The technology that recognizes who is receiving benefits and that gives money into people's bank accounts, that's pretty apolitical most of the time. So being clear about what is actually just infrastructural change, which, new minister, you need to carry on funding this, otherwise it's going to fall off a cliff, I think is part of it as well.
Yeah. Coming back to the users of the services, there is a question about Ford's famous quota about asking customers what they want and hearing that they want faster horses. So is there a limit in trusting the customers on what they really want?
Yeah.
Maybe they want cars.
What's interesting about that quote is that it comes up a lot, and actually, I don't think Ford actually ever said it. But it's an interesting one because I think the reason why it comes up is because we think that understanding user needs is the same as asking people what they want. And that is really difficult when we're providing a service, particularly in a public context, that is a service that people don't want. People don't want to pay their taxes, or they don't want to have to go through a visa and immigration process, or they don't want to go to prison. But that doesn't mean that we don't need to make those things work. And so there is a difference between what people say that they want and what is actually needed. And I think part of it is about understanding, how do we help people to do the right thing more easily? And how do we stop people from doing the wrong thing also really easily? And that means understanding how people will try and circumnavigate a process, how we can make sure that we're not artificially, kind of promoting one user group over another group. And yeah, the two things are very different. And I think understanding that nuance is one of the first things that we need to do when it comes to understanding accessible user-centered services in government, because it's different for us. We're not Amazon, we're not Google, we're not 100% of the time making something that people want, but our services need to be that much more accessible because, of course, we are catering to 100% of people 100% of the time. And if you consider that half of them don't want to use the service in the first place, it needs to be even better because they don't want to use it.
Okay.
That would be my rant.
So thank you, Lou. We have a lot of questions, but the time is up. And actually, you can find answers on your website.
Yep. Or you can contact me, any of those places. Yeah.
So find Lou online and then really find answers to your questions. And actually, there is one really good comment that I also received. So thank you, Lou, for your great thoughts and tips. We will start today. So this is
excellent.
Excellent. Good. Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much. Thanks.